June 1864. Cold Harbor. The name itself feels like a warning, a place where warmth refused to live. The sky hung low that summer, heavy with the scent of rain and powder, a gray pall over fields that had once been green. The battle had ended, or so they thought, the guns quiet, the smoke thinning the screams, fading into the wet breath of the earth. But even as the last echo of musket fire rolled away, the ground beneath them seemed to move. A slow, uneasy stirring, as though the soil itself had grown restless. Men who had endured days of slaughter began to whisper that something still walked among them, something not bound by sides or flags or uniforms. The killing had stopped, but death, it seemed, was not yet finished with Cold Harbor. They said the first to notice were the grave diggers, the ones left behind to shovel the clay and bury the heaps of bodies left by the battle. At night, when their lanterns guttered and the fog rolled low, they would hear it, the scrape of dirt, steady, deliberate, rhythmic as breath. Not the shuffle of boots, nor the scurry of rats, but something else. Slower, heavier, more purposeful. The sound of hands or claws working through soil still wet with blood. And sometimes above that rhythm came another sound, faint, mocking, impossibly human. A laugh. Not loud, not crazed, just enough to make the heart freeze. By dawn, the graves they had filled were open again. The shovels lay untouched. The earth was torn as if by the hands of something that did not care to wait for heaven or hell. At first, the officers dismissed it. Exhaustion, trench fever, shared delusion. The men were filthy, sleepless, half-starved. Of course, they saw shadows where none existed. But when they began to find the mounds collapsed, the crosses tilted, the soil churned as though it had been turned from beneath. The laughter stopped being a joke. One soldier, whose name has long been lost to history, left behind a single page in his journal. "The ground is alive here," he wrote. "I saw eyes in the dark, yellow like coals. It laughed, and then it was gone." When they found his tent the next morning, he was missing. Only his rifle remained half buried in mud muzzle, pointing toward the trenches, as if he'd tried to defend himself from something that came crawling out of the earth itself. Soon the whispers spread beyond a single camp. Even across the line, men on both sides spoke of the same thing. A shape that moved after midnight, keeping low, never seen clearly, never shot, never caught. A creature, they said, that prowled the no-man's land between the trenches, digging through shallow graves, sniffing, laughing, vanishing with the mist before dawn. Those who caught sight of it called it a scavenger, a beast drawn by the stink of war. Others said it was no beast at all, but a spirit, a soul too corrupted to rest, condemned to dig until the end of days. And a few, the ones who had seen its eyes glint through the fog, claimed it wore a smile, broad, crooked, almost human. One Confederate lieutenant left behind a short note in his field diary the night before he disappeared. "Whatever haunts this place," he wrote, "feeds not on flesh, but on the memory of death itself." The next morning, they found his pistol buried in the mud, 6 shells fired, but no trace of him anywhere. The Richmond Dispatch ran a brief piece a week later, buried between casualty lists and supply reports. "A peculiar animal of hyena aspect observed near the Cold Harbor front," it read. Men attribute it to hysteria of the field. And yet, even in print, there was something in the phrasing too careful, too precise, as though the writer feared saying more. The story ended there. No follow-up, no investigation. But the silence said enough. After the war, locals refused to plow near the trenches. Their mules would halt and snort, their dogs would cower, and when storms came, they swore they could hear the same sound rising from the fields. A muffled rhythm beneath the thunder, like laughter caught under 6 feet of clay. Farmers who built homes near the old lines found their cellars sinking their wells, tasting of rust. Children were told never to play near the hollow by the tree line, and when they asked why, the elders only said, "That's where it digs." The land had taken something from the men who fought upon it, and in return it had learned their sound, their motion, their madness. Years later, a survey team arrived to mark the boundaries of the battlefield. They mapped the trenches, recorded the positions of the fallen, drew clean lines across ground that refused to be orderly. And yet, even they felt it, a tremor beneath their boots, the faint smell of decay in air too cold for rot. They found patches of soil freshly disturbed, as though someone had been digging only hours before. In one pit, they uncovered shreds of fabric, the faded blue of Union wool. But no bone, no button, no trace of a man. The lead surveyor wrote a final note at the bottom of his report before the folder was archived and forgotten. Do not reopen this ground. The smell lingers. The years passed. The field grew quiet. The grass returned thin but stubborn. But every generation that walked there heard the same story. The one whispered after sunset when fog rose from the low marshes and the air turned thick. A story about the hyena that laughed among the dead. A story about the night watcher of Cold Harbor. And even now, if you stand alone in that field when the wind dies and the night deepens, you might hear it too. A single breath of sound too close to the earth to be the wind. A low, broken laugh that doesn't belong to any living man. And the faint shifting of soil, as if something beneath it has just remembered your name. Cold Harbor, Virginia, June 1864. The land lies still now, but once it shook like a living thing. This was farmland once soft and rich, where oaks grew wide and the soil smelled of rain. Families had lived here, carved from the wilderness, their fields green with corn and wheat. But that summer the crops were gone. The orchards stood broken. The air once sweet with honeysuckle now tasted of gunpowder and rot. War had moved in, and where war comes, the earth itself becomes a witness. By the time the two armies met here, the land had already seen years of blood. Virginia's fields had been cut open again and again, by shovels, by shells, by the boots of men who no longer remembered why they fought. In early June, Cold Harbor became another name added to that list, another wound on a body already dying. The Union line stretched across the northern rise trenches, dug deep into clay so red it looked like dried blood. Across the shallow valley, the Confederate guns crouched low behind mounds of dirt and sharpened logs. Between them lay open ground, no trees, no cover, just 200 yards of death. Grant had ordered the assault at dawn. His officers objected. The ground was too soft, the enemy too ready. He said the war would not wait. And so the men climbed from their trenches at sunrise, tens of thousands of them, rifles held high, faces streaked with mud and sweat. What happened next was not a battle. It was a slaughter written by thunder. In less than 20 minutes, more than 7,000 men fell. Bodies collapsed in waves, the living crawling beneath the dead to escape the next volley. The air burned with smoke. The ground boiled with shrapnel. The wounded tried to crawl back toward safety, but every inch of ground was alive with bullets. By the time the sun was overhead, the dead lay stacked 3 deep in some places. The survivors would later say that even the crows refused to land. When night fell, the silence was worse. No gunfire, no commands. Only the low, wet sound of breath, men dying slowly in the dark. The wounded called out for water, for their mothers, for God. But no one came. The cries grew fewer as the hours passed until all that remained was the wind whistling through broken rifles and shattered helmets. And then another sound, faint, almost gentle. The scrape of dirt being moved. At first, no one dared to speak of it. The men were delirious from exhaustion, half-starved, caked in mud and fear. They thought it was rats. Or perhaps the wind shifting the loose soil of the trenches. But the sound kept coming slow, patient, deliberate. It came from the burial pits, from the shallow mounds where they had laid their friends only hours before. And sometimes with it came something else. A low, dry laugh that rolled through the fog like smoke. On the second night, a sentry named Corporal James Harlan of the 11th Pennsylvania stood watch near the front line. He saw movement beyond the stakes, a shape low to the ground, creeping among the dead. He called out, No answer. The moon came out then, weak and pale, and Harlan swore he saw two eyes glinting back at him, yellow like coals. He fired once. The shape vanished. When his relief came at dawn, his post was empty. Only his rifle remained stuck barrel down in the mud, and a single print-long, crooked half-human pressed deep into the clay. Word spread quickly. Some said it was a hyena escaped from a traveling circus drawn by the scent of death. Others whispered that the devil himself had come to count the souls. But the men who had seen it said neither fit. They said it moved like a man, but did not stand like one. It crawled hunched, patient, clever. It did not eat the flesh, nor drag the bodies. It only dug. And when you shouted, it laughed. By the fifth night, the trenches were alive with fear. The chaplain, Reverend Henry Wilcox, tried to calm the men. He told them it was superstition born from grief and sleeplessness. But that evening, he too wrote something strange in his field journal. The men refuse to rest. They say it digs again. I told them the Lord keeps the dead safe. But when I prayed aloud, something answered me with laughter. 2 nights later, the Reverend was gone. His tent was found slashed from the inside. His Bible lay open in the mud, the pages torn out down to Job 4:14. Fear came upon me and trembling, which made all my bones to shake. After that, the officers forbade talk of the watcher. They called it hysteria. They said silence would kill the rumor, but silence only made it louder. Men refused night duty. Lanterns burned through the dark. The trenches glowed with fear. Even Confederate sentries reported hearing something, the faint scrape of claws, the soft chuckle of something unseen, always near the graves. When the war reporters reached Richmond, they printed the story once and never again. A peculiar animal of hyena aspect, seen near the Cold Harbor sector, read the dispatch. The cause of much alarm among the troops. After that, the Army buried not only the bodies, but the truth. When the armies moved south, Cold Harbor was left behind. The trenches filled with rain. The wood rotted. Grass crept slowly back across the scars. But the land never healed. Farmers who came to reclaim the soil found their plows catching on bones. The mules refused to walk certain furrows. At night they said the ground groaned as if turning in its sleep. And every so often the laughter came again, distant, muffled, rising from beneath the field, just as the thunder began to roll. Years turned to decades. The war ended, the maps were redrawn, but the stories remained. Old soldiers returned for reunions and stood at the edge of the field in silence. Some saluted, some wept. One was heard to whisper, "It's still here." Another answered, "It never left." Locals avoided the place. Children grew up knowing that after sunset the field belonged to something else. Hunters said their dogs went mad near the trenches. One farmer's wife claimed she saw the earth move on a night with no wind, as though something beneath were breathing. And every spring, when the rains came heavy, the ground bled rust. By 1872, when the first surveyors returned to map the old battlefield, they found the same strange things. The soldiers had disturbed soil sinkholes, where graves had been fragments of uniform cloth clawed apart with no bones inside. The men refused to continue. The lead surveyor wrote one final line before leaving the report unsigned. "Do not open this ground again." Cold Harbor. The name endures, the field endures, and perhaps the thing beneath endures too. In old sailors' language, a cold harbor meant shelter without warmth, a place to rest but not to live. Maybe that's what this land became, a harbor for the restless, for the half-buried, for the memory of men who could not leave what they had done. And even now, if you walk that ground in the stillness between rain and dawn, you might hear it, the soft movement of earth, the slow turn of history remembering itself. You might tell yourself it's just the wind. You might believe that. But the soil remembers, and sometimes it still laughs. The story of Cold Harbor did not end with the war. It simply changed hands from soldiers' whispers to archivists' ink. What was once fear became paperwork. What was once myth became marginal notes. And somewhere inside that bureaucratic quiet, the truth hid itself in plain sight, buried among the files like another unmarked grave. There are records, faint crumbling tucked between casualty lists and supply manifests. Letters that were never meant to be read aloud. They tell the same story over and over, in different words under different seals. Always the same sound, the same movement, the same laughter beneath the ground. The Richmond Dispatch, June 14, 1864. A short paragraph buried between updates on troop movements and hospital shortages. Reports from the Cold Harbor front continue to describe a peculiar animal of hyena aspect observed prowling the lines at night. Several men claim to have heard its cries, a sound, not unlike laughter, rising among the trenches. Officers attribute these accounts to exhaustion and overwrought nerves. There is no follow-up, no correction, no name of the reporter. In the corner of the original clipping, one faint pencil mark remains. One word, suppress. A week later, a letter addressed to Colonel Palmer of the 12th Virginia. Sir, the men persist in telling stories of a scavenger beast disturbing the graves of the fallen. Such tales are unfit for soldiers. Discipline will be required if this nonsense continues. The enemy must not learn that our ranks are haunted by childish fears. The letter is signed, but smudged the name unreadable. A second note written by the same hand 2 days later says, "Only night patrol missing." Section 7 disturbed again. Then the formal report. Filed, dated, sealed, June 19, 1864. Patrols from B Company discovered 2 recently filled graves open again by morning. Remains partially removed. No evidence of human interference. No shovel marks. No footprints except irregular impressions in the mud. Length of each impression, approximately 12 inches. Shape indeterminate. Witnesses report hearing laughter during the night watch. Recommend reburial under guard. And then one word, circled 3 times again. Across the river in the Union, records another version of the same event appears. The Army Medical Inspector's Office kept meticulous notes. Field surgeons, hospital clerks, chaplains. One entry stands apart. 2 patients removed from post due to severe nervous collapse. Both claim to have seen a creature digging among the graves near Cold Harbor. Symptoms include tremors, hallucinations, and refusal to sleep. One insists the creature called his name. Diagnosis: battle fatigue. Underneath a second line added in another hand, fainter, hesitant. If hallucination, why identical descriptions from both sides? Private Eli Thurmond, 8th Maine Volunteers. His diary survived because it was found in a trunk that no one opened for 50 years. The first pages are ordinary rations, weather orders. Then halfway through June, the tone shifts. The air smells of iron and sickness. The men dig shallow now. There is no time for proper burial. At night we hear something. It waits until the fires die. It digs where we have buried them. The sound is too steady to be animal. 2 days later, they told me I imagined it. But tonight I saw it dig where Sergeant Leary lies. When I shouted, it stopped. Then it laughed. God help me, it laughed. The next morning, Thurman's bunk was empty. His rifle was clean, his boots still lined up at the tent door. The clerk marked him missing, presumed deserted. He never returned. A Confederate engineer named D.H. Knox wrote that he refused to sleep underground after his work crews found unexplained collapse of trenches soil disturbed from below. He complained to his commanding officer, describing sinkage without cause. The report's closing line, suggest relocation of encampment. The suggestion was denied. 2 nights later, the trench caved in completely. They recovered only one man still clutching his rifle, his mouth filled with clay. After the war in 1871, a government reburial team arrived to transfer bodies from the field to the new Cold Harbor National Cemetery. Their logs were meant to be simple exhumation numbers, coffin counts, transport details. But halfway through the ledger, the tone changes. During excavation, several marked graves found empty. No disturbance visible from surface. Soil compact, consistent with age. In one instance, uniform remnants recovered without remains. Fabric shredded, no bones present. Signs of gnawing inconsistent with known scavengers. Reburial completed, file closed. The word inconsistent was underlined 3 times. On the back of the same page, written sideways in pencil, a single sentence, heard the laughter again. Another report from that same summer, unsigned, undated. We dug too deep. We found nothing, and yet something moved the air. The soil breathed beneath us. One of the men fainted. The others swore they felt fingers in the mud. Recommend immediate closure of site. The folder was sealed, mislabeled, and forgotten until 1912. When it was opened again, the paper had darkened with time. But the ink, the word again, was still sharp. A local paper. The Hanover Sentinel ran a curious note in 1878. Residents near the old battlefield report laughter at night said to come from beneath the ground. The sound is faint, like air escaping from the earth. The phenomenon has occurred 3 times this month, always following heavy rain. Beneath it, a short editor's disclaimer. We print this without endorsement. By the turn of the century, the reports were quieter, but they never stopped. During the construction of a memorial road in 1901, workers found fragments of uniform cloth buried deep in clay federal blue, torn and brittle. No bone, no metal, just the fabric shredded as if by blunt claws. The foreman recorded the find, said nothing more, and continued his work. But years later, when his notebook was discovered among his effects, one phrase had been added to the margin in faded pencil: eyes in the dirt. Time softened the language, but not the pattern. By the 1920s, historians treated the watcher as folklore, a story to sell postcards and books. But local caretakers still refused to work after dark. They left small gifts on the soil coins, whiskey bits of bread, as if feeding something old. When asked, one said, "It keeps the ground still." In the 1940s, the park rangers of the newly dedicated battlefield began keeping incident logs. One dated April 12, 1946, stands out. Observed movement near northern trenches, no wildlife present. Heard low sound, possibly laughter. Found small section of soil, turned through compact and dry. No prints visible. The report ends with the superintendent's red annotation, "Discard." Night sounds often misleading. But that same ranger never came back after his last shift. His lantern was found still burning beside a pit of newly disturbed soil. The ground was smoothed over as if pressed flat by hand. His badge was recovered 6 feet away. The wind that night carried a smell of damp clay and something older, a scent that made the horses bolt. In the following decades, researchers and archivists would encounter the same story in new disguises. Grave records, missing numbers. Files misfiled. Photographs misdeveloped. Each error small enough to ignore. But together, they trace a pattern, the quiet erasure of presence. The sense that something beneath the surface keeps rewriting history one line at a time. Even now, the records are incomplete. In the cemetery archives, certain pages are still missing. Whole rows of names without locations. Markers without bodies. When asked, the clerks say, "Lost in transfer." But the old groundsmen tell another version, that the earth gives back what it chooses, and what it keeps forever. The last file in the Cold Harbor archive bears no date, no seal, no name, just 4 words written by a trembling hand. It never stopped digging. And beneath that, pressed faintly into the paper, a single fingerprint, the smudge of someone who tried to close the file, but not soon enough. When the war ended, the armies left Cold Harbor behind, but the ground didn't let go. The fields healed on the surface, grass covering scars, trees pushing through clay, yet beneath that thin layer of peace, something old kept moving. The soldiers went home, but their stories stayed. They grew in the mouths of those who'd seen too much changing, with every retelling like wounds that never close. The first storytellers were the ones who stayed, the freedmen, the gravediggers, the widows, who worked the land because no one else dared to. They said the trenches never stayed flat. That after every rain, the earth shifted, the mounds sank, and the markers leaned as if the ground was restless. Some nights, when the fog rolled in, thick as breath, the old men digging fence posts would hear it, a sound low and rhythmic, like soil being turned by invisible hands. They said, if you stood still long enough, you could feel the vibration through your boots, a steady, shallow pulse, like a heartbeat, somewhere deep beneath the clay. One of them, a man named Isaac Proctor, told a newspaperman in 1872 that he'd seen it once, a shape rising from a trench, crawling on all fours covered in dirt, its eyes burning like candle ends in the dark. He said it stopped halfway up, turned its head, and looked right at him. He dropped his lantern and ran. When the reporter asked what it looked like, Proctor only whispered, like a man that had forgotten he was dead. The reporter laughed, wrote nothing, but when his notebook was later found among his things, one line had been underlined twice. It looked back at me. As years passed, the tale spread across counties. Farmers whispered of a night scavenger, something that came when thunder rolled, a creature drawn by the sound of artillery, by rain on broken soil, by the scent of new graves. It left tracks too long for a wolf, too deep for a man. Children were told not to stray near the gullies where the old trenches had caved in. Stay out of the hollow when the sky grumbles. Mothers warned, for the ground there still eats. By 1885, the story had changed again. Now they called it the Laugher, a spirit that mocked the living, a hyena from hell, sent to remind men that no one truly wins a war. Old soldiers returning to visit the graves swore they could hear it still, that in the low wind just after sunset they could make out laughter rising from the soil, faint but steady, echoing through the trees like breath caught in the throats of ghosts. One veteran told a reporter in Richmond that he saw a figure crouched over a grave, digging bare-handed. He called out thinking it was a thief. The figure turned, smiled, and vanished. The reporter printed nothing. Some truths, even in peace, were bad for the nation's sleep. The legend evolved again in the 1890s when America discovered seances and table rapping. Mediums came to the South to summon the voices of the dead. And someone no one remembers who invited one to Cold Harbor. Her name was Madame Althea. She and 7 others gathered in a farmhouse near the edge of the battlefield one stormy night. Only 6 would see dawn. A widow's diary found years later described what happened. At first, there was nothing she wrote. The candles flickered the air, still as stone. Then came a knock beneath the floor 3 times, soft, deliberate. The table trembled. The medium's eyes rolled back. When she spoke, her voice was not her own. It said, "He is not among the dead. He eats what they leave behind." When the storm passed, the table lay overturned, the floor scratched from beneath. The 7th guest was gone. The sheriff sealed the house and burned it down a week later. The land remains empty to this day. In 1907, a Cherokee laborer working on the new road through Cold Harbor told an anthropologist that the legend was older than the battle itself. He said the place had always been known as a hungry ground, a stretch of land that takes more than it gives. Long before Blue and Gray fought there, the tribes called it Adawehi Hilautseli, the spirit that digs at night. He said the settlers plowed over sacred mounds, broke stones that marked ancient burials, and built homes on bones that were never meant to be disturbed. When the war came, the land remembered. It woke up, he said, and it learned the taste again. The anthropologist dismissed the story as superstition, but he wrote one curious line in the margin of his notes. Tracks like a dog's end in hands. By the 1920s, the battlefield had become a national park. Tour guides spoke of troop movements and tactics, not the laughter in the dark. But locals still left offerings, whiskey bread salt along the fences. Not out of belief, but out of habit. The caretakers said it kept the soil from sinking. When visitors asked why, they'd just smile and say old ground's got to eat something. One caretaker, Ellis Boone, worked the field for 20 years before he quit without notice. He told the ranger who replaced him that he'd seen the thing with his own eyes. It was bent over a grave, slow, careful, like it was looking for someone. The moon caught its face and it smiled at me. Not like an animal, like it knew I was watching. Boone left the next morning, moved west, and never spoke of it again. During the Great Depression, scavengers came to dig for scrap metal belt buckles, bullets, buttons. They said the field gave up more than it should have. One man, Silas Merriweather, was found dead near his cart hands, buried wrist-deep in dirt, mouth open as if he'd been laughing when he died. The coroner called it suffocation from collapse. But the sheriff's notes told another story. Eyes wide smile, fixed, soil packed inside. After that, the scavengers stopped coming. The ground was left alone again. By World War II, soldiers training nearby brought the legend back to life. They called it the hyena of Cold Harbor. In letters home, they wrote of strange nights, laughter echoing through the trees, foxholes caving in for no reason, the earth trembling like something underneath was moving. One sergeant said it always came after thunder. When the sky rumbles, it answers, he wrote. The land still remembers cannon fire. Folklorists later dismissed these tales as echoes of older myths, the way trauma passes from one generation to the next. But some saw a pattern. Every time a new war began, the old stories stirred again, as if the ground knew. The 1960s brought tourists, cameras, and microphones. Historians came to document the human cost of war, but their equipment caught something else. In 1962, a researcher named Margaret Avery recorded ambient night sounds near the trenches. On the tape, you can hear wind insects, the hum of power lines. Then, faintly, at the 37-minute mark, a soft, throaty chuckle. It lasts 3 seconds, then fades. Avery dismissed it as static. But when sound technicians analyzed the reel decades later, they found no trace of electrical interference. The frequency matched that of a human voice, low-strained, nearly breathless. They tried to filter it, amplify it, make sense of it. The words, if they were words, sounded like still digging. The legend spread again, reshaped by new tongues. Teenagers called it the grave hyena. Ghost hunters called it the watcher. Locals stopped naming it at all. They simply nodded toward the dark trees and said, "Don't linger there after dusk." Hunters claimed their dogs refused to enter certain hollows. Campers woke to find claw marks in the mud near their tents, arranged in circles, not random, but deliberate. And on nights when fog lay heavy, a few swore they saw eyes low to the ground, watching. Modern skeptics said it was just wind or animals, or imagination fed by too much history. But the old families, the ones whose grandparents had buried the bodies, never argued. They left the field alone. They knew better than to explain a thing that had already been fed so well. Folklore doesn't die. It adapts. It changes names, trades, faces, shifts shape. But its hunger remains constant. Cold Harbor's myth became a mirror, a way for each generation to face what war had done to the land and to themselves. It wasn't just about a creature. It was about memory, the kind that refuses to rest. Some say the laughter was never meant to frighten, that it was the land's way of reminding the living what they left behind. Others say it's the echo of the soldier's own madness still clawing its way out of the soil. But whatever truth lies beneath it keeps digging. And every time thunder rolls across Virginia, the ground trembles once more as if something beneath still remembers the sound of guns and still laughs at the silence that followed. War doesn't bury its ghosts. It only sends them forward, changing uniforms, changing continents, changing the language of fear. Cold Harbor was just the beginning. After that field fell silent, the same sound, the same laughter began to follow men wherever they dug trenches, wherever they bled into soil that wasn't theirs. Every war inherits the hunger of the last one. Every field remembers what it was fed. When British soldiers reached France in 1916, they wrote letters home about mud that moved. The Somme, they said, was not just a battlefield, it was a living wound. One private, Arthur Greeley, wrote to his sister, "The ground swells at night like it's breathing. You can hear it under you if you lie still." Sometimes between the guns, there's laughter, not the laughter of men, but of the earth itself mocking us for thinking we can win. She never received that letter. The mud swallowed both him and his trench. When the area was excavated years later, they found no remains, only a rifle twisted into the clay barrel, bent muzzle pointing down as if it had been fired into the ground. In the official war diaries, officers wrote of sonic illusions, ground tremors, trench hysteria. But the pattern was always the same. Graves opening themselves, bodies vanishing, soldiers claiming to hear something moving beneath them. In one report, a French sergeant describes a scavenger thing, like a jackal that came up after bombardments, its laughter rolling across the cratered fields. Another wrote, "The more we bury, the more it digs. The land won't keep what we give it." No one spoke the words Cold Harbor, but the story was identical. Different war, same soil, same hunger. By the time the Second World War began, the legend had gone global. In North Africa, where the dunes were full of the bones of older empires, soldiers spoke of something that prowled the burial pits after sandstorms. They called it the Laughing Jackal. The official reports list jackal interference, but one chaplain, Father Morris Keene, wrote privately, "They laugh before the wind picks up. The sound comes from nowhere. Men won't dig after sunset. They say the ground moves. They say it's older than this desert, older than us." A corporal named Tully described finding a grave disturbed overnight. When he followed the tracks, they vanished halfway across the dunes, ending in what looked like the imprint of fans pressed into the sand. He burned his shovel the next day. Years later, when interviewed for a documentary that never aired, Tully said only this: "You can fight the enemy, but you can't fight the ground. It laughs because it knows how it ends." And then came Vietnam. Another jungle, another war, another soil, thick with memory. American troops stationed near Quang Tri wrote home about strange sounds during the monsoon nights. Low laughter carried by the wind pits caving in. Without warning, foxholes that filled with water and then with silence. At first they blamed wild dogs or superstition among the locals. But when a patrol found a grave freshly dug open with no footprints nearby, they stopped joking. A Montagnard elder told one officer a story the Americans didn't want to hear. He said the jungle had a spirit that followed war, a thing that eats the noise of dying men. He said it had been here before long, before the French, long before the Americans. And when they asked where it came from, he answered simply, "It walks behind you." He called it the one who digs back. One Marine, writing to his wife, described watching something in the distance while on perimeter duty. "I thought it was a man crawling, maybe wounded. But it moved wrong. Too fast. When the flare lit up, it stopped and looked at me. I could see its teeth. It smiled. Then it sank straight into the mud, like the ground swallowed it whole." He never mailed that letter. It was found among his effects after he disappeared during a storm patrol 2 days later. Folklorists call it the migratory haunting, a myth that evolves with each war as if something ancient keeps finding new names. But what if it's not migration? What if it's memory not of men, but of the earth itself? What if the same hunger that began at Cold Harbor learned to cross oceans, following the echo of gunfire feeding on the silence that follows? In Korea, soldiers reported laughing winds on nights after heavy shelling. In Iraq, American units near Al-Hila wrote of sand that shifted when there was no breeze and of hearing chuckles in the radio static. One officer described the ground as breathing like a sleeping animal. The report was classified as psychological contagion. But the historian who reviewed it made a note in the margin. Same cadence as Cold Harbor recordings, laughter frequency consistent. In 2006, Dr. Nora Campbell of the Smithsonian's Folklife Division began mapping global battlefield legends. She found something no one expected. When she plotted every report of laughing ground breathing soil or grave disturbances since 1864, they formed a pattern of curved suns stretching from Virginia through Europe to Southeast Asia and back again. She called it the Watcher Line. Her conclusion was simple. Folklore travels with armies. The land carries memory. The myth remembers for us when we refuse to. But in her private notes, she wrote something else. The disturbances correspond to areas with high iron and bone deposits, same readings as Cold Harbor clay. The pattern repeats every 40 years. Something is following the wars. Her report was never published. She resigned the following spring. Her car was found abandoned outside the Cold Harbor Park gates. Inside was a laptop. Its drive had been wiped clean except for a single audio file labeled Field Recording, Hanover. It was 47 seconds long. Most of it was wind. But near the end, faintly a low breath and a laugh. The bridge between folklore and fact grows thinner with every generation. When men returned from the Persian Gulf, they told of the same sound echoing in their helmets at night. A dry, distant laugh buried in the wind. In Afghanistan, soldiers dug trenches in old Soviet soil and said the earth there was already awake. Even drone operators thousands of miles away, never touching the ground, reported hearing strange distortion through the feed during bombardments, a hiss that sometimes resembled laughter. A sound engineer at the Department of Defense analyzed the frequencies and found something unsettling. The recordings from Iraq, from Vietnam, from archival World War I phonographs all shared a single tone, a low pulsing rhythm, repeating every 8 seconds, the same as the seismic vibrations recorded beneath Cold Harbor during ground surveys. He filed it under acoustic coincidence. But in the final line of his report, before it was redacted, he wrote, "The soil speaks the same language everywhere men die, and so the bridge stretches from one war to the next, from mud to sand to jungle. Every soldier hears the same sound, though they call it by different names. Every generation inherits the same silence that follows laughter. Every ground that drinks enough blood learns to hum with memory. Some say it's nothing more than the echo of conscience. Others believe the earth keeps count, that the laughter is its way of balancing the debt. But maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe every battlefield is just another mouth. And Cold Harbor was the first to learn how to open. The wars come and go. The men change. But the pattern remains always the same line, the same rhythm, the same sound, under the silence. The ground never forgets what it's been fed, and somewhere deep beneath the trenches of history, something still digs slow, patient, laughing softly in the dark. The legend might have stayed buried forever, just another ghost story passed through the generations, if not for the files that began to resurface. Old reports, missing records, photographs without negatives. And the one thing that connected them all, disturbed graves, empty soil, laughter caught between the lines of history. The first rediscovery came by accident. In 1998, a Library of Congress archivist named Helen Raines was digitizing Civil War casualty lists. The Cold Harbor records should have been complete, over 7,000 confirmed dead cataloged by name rank and regiment. But when she cross-referenced them with the reburial manifests from 1871, 17 names were missing. Not misfiled missing. The graves existed. The stones were marked. But when opened for verification in 1908, every coffin was empty. No bones, no uniforms. Just compacted soil as if something had passed through, taken what it wanted, and sealed the ground behind it. The reburial team noted burrow activity. But the depth 5 feet down ruled out any known scavenger. In the margin of the report written in faint graphite, someone added, "The laughter stopped for 2 nights." Raines dug deeper. Every war had similar anomalies, small, quiet, easy to ignore. The Somme, Verdun, El Alamein, Quai-Sun, each one with graves listed as verified but empty. Each one with the same phrasing somewhere in the paperwork, disturbance consistent with tunneling. Each one missing a handful of names, never the same number, never explained. When she plotted them on a map, the pattern formed a curve across continents, a slow, deliberate migration that matched the path of Western warfare for 150 years. She didn't call it a haunting. She called it the Watcher Line. In 2006, a Smithsonian field analyst named Dr. Nora Campbell inherited Raines's unfinished work. Campbell wasn't a folklorist. She was a geophysicist, an expert in seismic resonance and soil behavior. She noticed something Raines hadn't. The ground beneath old battlefields vibrated at a different frequency than surrounding terrain. Even after a century, it pulsed faintly rhythmic, consistent, alive. She set sensors at Cold Harbor, Verdun, and the Mekong Delta. All 3 recorded identical patterns, 1 tremor every 8.4 seconds. She compared it to natural phenomena, earthquakes, wind pressure, animal burrows, but nothing matched. The tremor came from below, but not deep, 5, maybe 6 feet down, exactly where the dead should have been. Her report was short, clinical, almost defensive. The readings are non-random. They do not correspond to groundwater temperature or tectonic noise. Origin undetermined. Recommend extended monitoring. In the corner of her field notebook, however, was one sentence not meant for publication. "Feels like breathing." A month later, she disappeared. Her rental car was found outside the Cold Harbor Visitor Center. The keys were still in the ignition. In the trunk, her laptop wiped clean except for a single audio file titled Field Recording, Hanover. 47 seconds long. Most of it is wind. But near the end, a dry, rasping chuckle that rises once, then fades into silence. That same year, a team of Army Corps engineers restoring eroded sections of the cemetery logged an event that was never made public. On the night of October 12th, the motion sensors along Section D activated one by one in a straight line. No animals were detected. No movement on camera. Just a series of ground depressions appearing over the course of 3 minutes, moving north to south as though something were traveling beneath the surface. The lead engineer noted subsurface pressure, unknown cause. The supervisor crossed it out and wrote thermal expansion. But in the data log, you can still read the unedited note. Pattern rhythmic, 8-second intervals, like laughter. When a junior technician reviewed the seismic feed weeks later, she noticed something else. The pulses stopped precisely where the missing 17 graves were located. And then came the recordings. In 1910, long before anyone thought to fear such things, the U.S. Signal Corps had made experimental sound cylinders, wax discs meant to capture ambient noise on historic battlefields. The recordings were lost for decades. One cylinder labeled Cold Harbor, Night Wind 1910, resurfaced in 2014 during an archival cleanup. It was badly degraded, full of static and hiss. But at the 1-minute mark, the noise shifted, a hollow rasp, rising and falling, the cadence unmistakably human. Sound technicians cleaned the file, filtered the noise, and found what looked and sounded like laughter. Slow, dry, tired, rhythmic. When the waveform was compared to modern recordings of human respiration, the patterns matched exactly. Someone or something had been breathing into the soil. The archivist who restored the audio, James Kearney, resigned a month later. In his exit interview, he said, "I don't want to hear dirt breathe again." Forensic teams later attempted to reanalyze Cold Harbor's graves using ground-penetrating radar. The images returned were useless static noise voids where solid clay should have been. But when the analysts increased sensitivity, a shape appeared in the data, a curved line, shallow serpentine, as if a tunnel had been dug and then collapsed. At its deepest point, a cavity the size of a man. The technicians thought it was an anomaly. But when they examined the same plot the next day, the shape had moved 30 feet east. That was the last time ground-penetrating radar was used at Cold Harbor. The official explanation: equipment malfunction. Unofficially, they buried the readings under a new sidewalk. In 2017, declassified Army communications confirmed that similar ground anomalies had been detected at other war cemeteries: Normandy, Gallipoli, Okinawa. The internal report listed them as localized subsidence events. But the timestamps revealed a strange coincidence. Each event occurred within hours of a major anniversary of a battle, almost to the minute. Everywhere the dead were remembered, the earth moved. A scientist reviewing the data wrote one phrase beside the timeline: "It responds to memory." Another analyst later added, "or feeding schedule." The story began to surface again in whispers among the military grave detail teams, the ones who maintain cemeteries across the world. They joked about the hyena clock, about how sometimes the ground sank just before inspection. But a few stopped laughing when one technician reported hearing faint chuckling through his ground sensor headset. He thought it was interference, until the sound repeated every 8 seconds perfectly, in rhythm with his own heartbeat. In 2019, a photograph leaked online. It showed a human skull recovered from a dig site near Al-Hilla, Iraq. The jaw was abnormally wide, the bone stretched almost into a grin. Carbon dating identified its composition as 19th century limestone-based fossilization consistent with Virginia clay. No one could explain how it ended up halfway across the world. The caption beneath the image, posted anonymously, read, "It's still laughing." The government dismissed the image as a hoax. But when investigators tracked the metadata, they found the photo uploaded from an IP address in Mechanicsville, Virginia, 3 miles from Cold Harbor. The original file has never been found. Scientists, historians, soldiers, they all tried to explain it. Soil resonance, acoustic illusions, coincidence. But the facts kept repeating like a confession whispered by the earth itself. Empty graves, matching frequencies, seismic laughter, something that moves when we remember, something that stops when we forget. One historian, reading through Raines's and Campbell's notes, summed it up in one line that never made it to print. "Whatever it is, it follows the living, not the dead. Maybe it isn't a ghost. Maybe it isn't even alive. Maybe it's memory condensed, physical, ancient, the instinct of the soil to reclaim what men keep trying to bury. Maybe Cold Harbor was the first time the ground learned that men would never stop feeding it. And maybe that's why the laughter never ends. Because the land knows the war isn't over. It just changed names. If you listen closely at night to a field in France, to a desert in Iraq, to a jungle clearing in Vietnam, you'll hear the same faint rhythm, a breath, a scrape, a low, deliberate chuckle that doesn't care what century it's in. The pattern continues 8 seconds apart like a slow heartbeat that belongs to the earth itself. The laughter doesn't mock us. It reminds us that the dead are gone, but the ground that fed on them is still awake. Somewhere under Cold Harbor, beneath the plaques and the marble and the grass that looks too green for what lies below, the soil still shifts at night. And if you stand there long enough, if you wait until even the wind goes still, you might feel it. A faint tremor under your boots, a shallow vibration that moves like breath, and then from somewhere deep, a sound that almost sounds like laughter. The kind of laughter that doesn't fade, because it's been there since the first shovel hit the first grave. Because it knows that sooner or later, someone will feed it again. Morning comes slow over Cold Harbor. The mist lingers longer here, as if the air itself doesn't want to let go. Dew glitters across the grass thin as tears, and the old earth steams faintly under the first light. Visitors walk quietly among the stones, their footsteps swallowed by the soft ground. To them, it's peaceful. To the land, it's memory-stirring. The war is long gone, at least that's what we tell ourselves. The markers are white now, the soil neatly trimmed, the blood long since washed away. But when you stand still, when you stop to listen, there's something in the silence that feels unfinished. As if the battle still hums beneath your feet, waiting for a voice to answer. Maybe it's not ghosts that haunt this place. Maybe it's the echo of men who never learned how to stop digging. Every war ends the same way, a line of graves, a speech, a silence. And somewhere beneath that silence, the ground takes another breath. You can't hear it in daylight, but at dusk, when the wind dies and the birds go quiet, it's there, a faint rhythm. Steady as a heartbeat, slow as regret. For a moment, imagine standing here in 1864. Smoke still clinging to the air. The sky low and bruised, the trenches steaming the smell of gunpowder and rain. 7,000 men lying where the grass stands now. Their last thoughts trapped beneath this soil, repeating forever. They thought they were fighting for the future. They didn't know they were feeding the past. And maybe that's the real haunting of Cold Harbor, not a creature, not a curse, but the sound of history devouring itself. War doesn't end when the guns go silent. It ends when the ground stops remembering. And this ground has never forgotten. Each generation comes to walk the same path. Soldiers, tourists, historians, caretakers. They bring flowers, prayers, cameras, questions. They leave with the same silence, because no one can quite explain why the soil feels different here, why the air seems thicker, why the grass never grows quite the same shade of green. The caretakers say it's just the clay, heavy, iron-rich, slow to drain. But those who've been here alone after dark know better. They talk about the stillness, not the calm kind, but the kind that feels like listening. As though the land itself is waiting for something, or someone, to speak first. There's an old saying among the locals. The ground at Cold Harbor doesn't take, it keeps. Maybe that's the price for what happened here. Maybe every field that's seen too much death learns to hold on to it, to keep a trace of it in its breath, in its pulse, in its laughter. If you stay long enough, you'll start to feel the rhythm. A small vibration through your shoes, gentle, almost kind. A sound beneath the sound, deeper than wind, older than thunder. And in that rhythm, you'll hear it, the faint laugh of the earth, tired and endless, reminding you that it remembers everything we try to forget. War moves on. Men die. Nations change. But the soil stays. It collects us layer by layer like pages in a book written in blood and rain. Cold Harbor was one chapter, the first, maybe in a story that never stopped being written. Every time the world builds a new battlefield, the earth listens. And somewhere it begins to hum again. Perhaps that's why every soldier feels it, the sense that something watches when they sleep, that every trench is a grave that just hasn't decided who belongs in it yet. The watcher isn't a beast. It isn't a curse. It's the echo of what war makes us, the laughter of the ground that knows it will always win. Now, in this quiet morning, the fog lifts. The field looks ordinary again, sunlight on wet grass, a crow in the distance, the hum of a car far away. Life has returned, but only on the surface. Beneath the rhythm continues, soft, patient, eternal. If you visit this place, stand still for a while. Don't speak, don't move. Just listen. The field will tell you its story, not with words, but with breath. Not with ghosts, but with memory. It will whisper the truth that every war forgets that the earth remembers everything. And sometimes it laughs. And as you walk away, the sound fades. The wind rises again, the birds return, and the field exhales. But somewhere beneath your last footprint, the ground stirs once more, reclaiming the shape of another visitor, another listener, another offering of life. It has waited this long. It can wait forever, because the war ended. But the ground never signed the treaty.